Was invited to give a presentation on a topic that actually I very much like, I'm very much into, but also I think needs some conceptual reframing. So I thought that this would be a very good opportunity to discuss with you on some of these issues. I'll try to keep my presentation within limits in order to give enough time for discussion, as I was told that you're a very active group, so you should actually prove that that's true. So also interrupt during the presentation if you feel like, and then we can start the discussion already as we go. The title doesn't originate from me. I think it was Balas. Was it? I don't know. No, just because I'm going to criticize it, and therefore I don't want to. Yes, no, but I think that was quite indicative of some mindset, which I think is very common in the literature, in the minority rights discourse, and I think needs, if not to be challenged, at least to be slightly adjusted. And that's what I'm trying to do during this presentation. So after a short introduction in the topic, you see here what are more or less the subjects I'm going to talk about, and then we will have, as I said, time for debating it. Now, just to contextualize a little bit the whole issue, the autonomy debate is very much on the rise lately, which could sound surprising in a way, because this is not a very popular topic, neither in the international organizations at all. I mean, they are quite horrified by the subject. Sometimes they play some lip service to the issue of autonomy, saying, okay, that it's something that might work, but you know, then in the end, they don't have a real clue about the details about autonomy, and we'll see how and why. But also on the side of the states, I mean, this autonomy debate is not a very, popular subject, because states are now trapped between two opposite poles. The ones fearing, saying, autonomy means secession, more or less, and we have vocal groups advocating for it. You're following certainly the debates, even in the democratic debates that are taking place, from Catalonia all the way to Scotland and possibly other areas. So on the one hand, that, on the other hand, of course, the fear that autonomy is something that at least equals losing control on the side of the state. So neither the international organizations nor the states are pretty much in love with the topic, but the literature and the overall debate, including by civil society, is keeping that issue very alive. Although, I must say, and I will come back to that later on, also in the literature, if you look at the scholarships or the scholarly pieces written by minority people, that's simplifying like that, then you have a certain approach to the autonomy issue. If you take the debates in the comparative federalism scholars, then this is completely different, I would say. And sometimes it is also difficult to find the right point in common between the two. So, I mean, yeah, But anyway, there are many more books coming out. We are just working together with Sasha in this coming out on territorial and non-territorial arrangements. The issue is quite important. The fact that people are invited to prestigious summer schools to talk about the issue, etc., etc. So this is something that it's still very much on the rise. As I said, no international guidance. If you take the international documents, they say, very superficial things, if any, about autonomy. And this is what I would call the status quo syndrome. That's typical for the international organizations. The international organizations are actually the product of the will of the states. And the states are, as we were commenting earlier, not very much in favor of this debate, especially because, the internal structure of a state is considered to be an internal matter of the state. So the international organizations, in principle, like the status quo. Whatever each country decides, its own internal structure, the international organizations do respect it, up until the time when it changes, and then all of a sudden they become in love with the new structure, even though it was happening in a questionable way legally. Let's take the example of Kosovo and some others. So it's fine. The international community is following the status quo up until the change of the status quo, and then it keeps liking the new status quo. So there is some schizophrenia on that. But also maybe it has to do with the shrinking international influence on all these issues. We were just talking to Anna Maria just before the class, and we were actually commenting the fact that international organizations have lost some grip. And I don't think this has to do with the international organizations. In first place, it has to do with the masters of the international organizations, the fact that the states are changing attitude. They are no longer the same as in the 90s, and they are not very willing to listen to what the international community has to say. This is happening more or less in every country in different degrees, as you certainly know. It's interesting because there is, on this rise, has also rediscovered the issue of non-territorial autonomy, which is even more surprising. It was considered to be a marginal topic, a niche issue, something for just a few interesting examples, not least Hungary, for example, but something that is tailor-made for some situation, but of course the real autonomy was always considered to be territorial autonomy. And then only if there were some reasons why territorial autonomy couldn't work, then you should go for plan B, and the second best option was considered to be non-territorial forms of autonomy, which again is an attitude that is being changing actually, and it has maybe also to do with some of the structural deficits of territorial autonomy itself, which is what I will try to highlight during this presentation. So, if the title was Territorial Autonomy, is it still a relevant option for minorities in Europe? If I can anticipate the answer would be yes, but, and yes, if. So, of course, yes, but it depends on a number of issues and if some conditions are met. Okay. Let's move on. And let's try to look at the difficult relationship between ethnicity and territory. I mean, this is something that we scholars, even normal people tend to take for granted. And this is something that depends on an implicit paradigm, on the fact that, you know, we are always used to consider some elements as given, and they are not necessarily given. Take here a few examples. You know, the country has, most countries have names after their majority population, or vice versa. We don't even know that. I mean, it's difficult. I'm trying to, you know, look at non-legal literature in order to try to find out how the names of populations and countries have been formed. It's extremely difficult, actually. So you don't really know whether, in general, you first have the name of a population, meaning the majority population of a specific territory, giving the name to a country, or whether the name was first given to the country and then the population, the majority population settled in that territory, was given the name of the country. I mean, it's really difficult. I'm still researching on that, so if you have some interesting hints about literature and where I can find out more on that, I would be very much grateful. But actually, you know, it's everywhere the same. You know, here I have some examples. All the land, all the stans or Pradesh in India, etc. It means land, means territory of, or, you know, people from that territory, as I was saying. And we are so used to think in that terms that we don't even think even more. It's kind of an implicit thing. But I think we should reflect a little bit more on that. But just to say how much rooted this sort of mentality is, that, you know, a territory does coincide with an ethnicity, you know, which is probably something that in the past was, you know, easier to understand, but nowadays, of course, gets more and more problematic and challenges this attitude towards territorial autonomy. It has always been like that. It's our mindset. It's already predefined, and this makes it very difficult to even consider, you know, to spend some time to think about it. Well, you might consider that what I'm saying now is just, you know, the old debate, especially in the political science debate, between ethnic and civic nationalism, and, you know, you have a more ethnically defined group approach or a more civic one. Well, there is, of course, some truth in that, but I don't think that's the correct type of terminological explanation we need to look for in order to get the right response to our question. First, because the attitude of the various groups are very different, and while some are actually, you know, very territorial and are framed in terms of territorial claims, others are actually reluctant to adopt that type of approach. Well, think of the Roma, for example, and many others, where you don't have a territorially framed identity, and therefore, you know, this ethnic versus civic approach doesn't completely fit. Then, because what we are talking about is actually not so much the nation-state approach, the nation construct, but it's more narrow as an approach. So try to look at the subnational entities in terms of territorial autonomy within a broader constitutional framework. So I'm not speaking about states in the proper sense. And we are looking at forms trying to territorially accommodate groups that are the majority in a specific territory, but are the minority in the overall country. So again, so you see the brackets here. They're predominantly inhabited by national minorities, so it means, you know, keep that with some reservation, of course. We are oversimplifying, and the debate is oversimplifying, but that's the way it is. So, you know, again, the nationalism type of terminology, I don't think fits very well. And also because terminology is, because of that, because of the predefined mindset, often generates big confusion. And there are just a few cases where this problem was, present to those who shaped the names, and then, of course, it was addressed properly. Example, Bosnian and Bosniak. You pretty well know who is a Bosnian, who is a Bosniak. And that's absolutely clear because that was, defined also in constitutional terms. But you can have, most of the examples in terms of defining an identity, a subnational identity, subnational at the moment at least, which is generating a lot of confusion. I don't know whether you have followed the debate of the parliamentary motion in Canada down in 2006-07 on the recognition of Quebec as a nation and the whole issue trying to settle down a little bit the Quebec independence movement. But if you take the French and the English term, then you have a completely different perspective and view. Who is a Quebecer and who is a Québécois? Do you think there is a difference? Of course there is a difference. It depends on the approach. But also, while Quebecer is pretty clearly a territorial definition, Québécois can mean both. Depends on who is saying that. So if it's a Québécois nationalist, it maybe means more something like the ethnicity. If it is a more civic type of approach, then it means something more like the inhabitant of the province, and so on and so forth. I'm coming from a region which is often used as a paradigm example for this type of territorial autonomy model for minorities, which is South Tyrol in the Italian Alps, which is inhabited predominantly by German speakers, where this dilemma is constant. We even have a complete fuzzy approach to the very name of the territory, because it's called South Tyrol in German, so the southern part of the Austrian Tyrol, but it's called Alto Adige in Italy, so it's the upper part of the Adige River. I mean, depends where you see it from, right? And same, if you say a South Tyrolean, tends to mean a German speaker, and if you use a Alto Atesino in Italian, it means probably the opposite, and so on and so forth, and the whole dilemma that has to do with a different perception. So that's why I think the nationalism terminology, especially in the political sciences, explains something, but I don't think gets it totally right. So we should also be terminologically very accurate when looking at these issues. Yeah, of course, then you have different nuances, you have different approaches, and each case is different, but also each case can be easily contextualized in a broader perspective. Let's try to identify, oversimplifying again, three main models of this type of relationship, as you can find in the comparative constitutional practice of autonomy regimes. I'll try to make it simple because this is of course didactical. It's not every category can be challenged, but it's just to try to take a picture of where we are at the moment. So one is when you have autonomy regimes that are based on the idea that territory is the only instrument for a protection of a group, and also the only framework which allows this group to participate in a broader national, whatever, state-wide decision-making. So you don't even need to define it ethnically, because it's so implicit that, of course, that group owns that territory, and by means of the territory, the group participates in decision making at the local level, of course, but also at the national level. So you have members of parliament coming from that region equals the fact that these people come from that group. There are reserved seats. There are all the forms of possible participation in decision making are through the territory and not through the group itself, just because the territory does coincide with the group. Very simple. Yes, please.
Do you think that territory is an exclusive one? Because both minority and majority interpret their interest differently. I mean, they claim it's a different group interpret their interest differently. Do you think it's the most?
Well, it depends on which case. Yes, of course. That's the point I'm getting to. But in some cases, you have a de jure coincidence between group and territory. I mean, that's most notably the case of islands, remote islands up in the north, like the Faroe Islands or the Åland or whatever. Even though there are many more groups than one may think, but legally speaking, it's very simple. The Åland Islands are exclusively Swedish-speaking territory within Finland, and its representation in the Finnish parliament, in international relations, is Swedish only. Period. That's very, very, very simple in a way. I agree with you. It's not like that. I have a wonderful picture I recently took in the Åland Islands in very, Nordic, Scandinavian, Viking type of place. This little wooden house, and it was, and then there was I think it was even a sort of a Scandinavian Viking drake on it, and then there was a kebab shop saying Draken Kebab. That was wonderful because it shows that even there, I mean, not really at the heart of Europe, you have much more diversity than you can experience. But legally speaking, it's simple. There is a full coincidence, and that's one of the approaches, not the only one. Yeah. And that's, of course, the simplest one, because then you have a complete coincidence, as I said, by law, not by fact. And then, okay, this is the way you represent things, yeah? Well, it's also very interesting because, here we don't have the time, and I probably don't even have enough knowledge to go too much into that. But it's interesting that you can find different approaches even within the same country. Like if you take New Caledonia and Corsica, two different islands, both belonging to France, then you see a completely different attitude. Well, might be justified by the distance, I don't know, and by the fact that New Caledonia is probably slowly going to separate from France. But New Caledonia has this attitude, and the French legal system, which is what you would say in the nation-state debate, a more civic type of approach, has a super ethnic one when it comes to a particular part of its country, which is New Caledonia. Whereas in terms of Corsica, of course, this is completely different. Okay, bracket, closing the bracket. So, but that's one of the approaches you can find. Yes, this homogeneity is either real or legally imposed. I would say, actually, now legally imposed. That's the easiest system, as I was saying. Because it's the same oversimplification that we have experienced, especially in the 19th century with the nation state. We have the same with the nation region. Easy. Hungary, well, Hungary is not the best example, maybe, but I don't know, Romania being the country of Romanians, yeah, and Croatia being the country of Croats, and Catalonia being the subnational entity, whatever, of Catalans. Not a good example either, because of course this is not the approach followed there. But Holland being the home of Hollanders, and it's absolutely the same attitude. So forgetting about the differences within the territory. Yeah. Sometimes this is very problematic, though. You know, your question actually points to that issue. It's a legal fiction. It's not the reality. In the Åland Islands, there was I think, ECM. No, it was not an ECMI paper a few years ago, saying, well, even in that very remote, small archipelago in the Gulf of Bothnia, you have more than 100 languages spoken. So the word is a lot more complex than this legal fiction considers. But then, of course, you oversimplify and just have one. The fiction is contested more and more. People realize that this is a fiction, and more and more people are not very happy with that fiction. Quebec could be an example. It's not only Francophone, as we know. There are considerable non-French speaking groups, from the English speakers to the natives, and then, of course, leave aside the whole issue of the second generation or migrants that are selected about the language, etc., etc. But also, it's not the only Francophone territory in Canada, and people don't usually forget about that, thinking, oh, of course, the Francophone territory in Canada is Quebec. It's not true. I mean, there is at least one more province where the ratio is about 50-50, plus the official French language, I mean, is also in other provinces. So they just seized the representation of the Canadian francophonie, and that's simply not mirroring the reality. So it is often contested. And then, of course, the more you look into the examples, you dig a little bit more under the surface, you see that, in fact, exceptions are spreading out more and more. Even in places where you have a purely territorial regime, like in Belgium, with the clearly defined linguistic borders, then you have exceptions. Then you have the linguistic islands within the Flanders, etc., etc., etc. Why? Simply because, exactly like the nation state cannot work in terms of homogeneous type of approach, and then you need to give rights to minority groups. Exactly the same happens at the subnational level, where you have increasing differences that claim recognition and rights, etc., and also, of course, need to be accommodated. So, this type of approach is showing its limits. That's the point. The second one is a bit more sophisticated. And it kind of shows a combination of the two elements, the ethnic and the territorial. I don't know why. Yeah. So quite clearly, the territorial autonomy was conceived and was designed and was drafted having in mind as the unique scope the protection of one, and occasionally a few more minority groups. But then this legal, the legal system developed in a way that actually considered from the very beginning the existence of differences, and these are reflected also in the legal system. They are not forgotten about the legal system, by the legal system. Well, an interesting case here would be Macedonia, for example. You know, it's a wonderful, still developing example of how things can change depending on the evolution also of the situation. There was, like in every former communist socialist countries, a form of paranoia and absolute obsession, ideological obsession with regard to any territorial regime. I mean, that's, you know, an F word. And so, of course, the Ohrid framework agreement starts off by saying, oh, there is no territorial solution to ethnic claims, by no means. Then what it does in the next paragraphs, it exactly devises a territorial solution for ethnic claims. Not at regional, subnational level, rather at local level, municipalities, etc. But it doesn't changes so much. And then the number of bilingual municipalities, you know, in terms of trying to overcome the drastic ethnic separation, has increased, especially after the territorial reform 2002, that was indirectly confirmed in a referendum 2004, which didn't meet the quorum. Plus some rulings of the Constitutional Court, including a very interesting one in 2007 on the use of flags of the various communities, has tried to ease down a little bit the whole situation. So the thing is evolving. An interesting example, again, is South Tyrol. I will come back to that at the end as an example, where, of course, the autonomy was absolutely clearly designed, even by means of an international agreement, for the protection of the German and partly the Ladin, small one, minority there. But then it was already designed with a system of power sharing, which does not exclude the other groups, but rather tries to accommodate them into the governance at the local level. And the third and last general approach that you can find is a more territorial type of approach, where ethnicity was actually the original factor for establishing a certain territorial autonomy. So it was not just established because of classical federative, aggregative paths like in traditional federal states. It was based on the ethnicity, but then the territorial dimension prevails and always prevailed from the very beginning, leaving the ethnic dimension kind of in the background. Again, Spain is an interesting case. The definition of who is Basque, who is Catalan is pretty much linguistic, voluntaristic. You identify yourself. If you, I can go if I'm able to learn properly Basque. Difficult task, by the way, I guess, but everything is possible in life. Then I could become a Basque. I mean, there's no ethnic, link on that, and I think I would even be quite welcome in the community. In other cases, as you know, it's rather different. And the whole debate of who is Catalan is also more or less the same thing, very territorially defined. And, the people coming from Latin America who have settled there and speak Catalan, they are Catalan. Or, a legally even more interesting example was the recent referendum on Scotland's independence last September, where even also due to EU rules, of course, where you cannot discriminate people easily who are citizens of the EU, all the residents were granted the right to vote. And there is nothing ethnic about that. And then, of course, you know the history, and you know that Scotland had an own history, etc., etc. But, that's not an ethnic issue by no means. Everyone who is residing there was allowed to vote as a Scot for the Scottish independence. And there is not even a language issue, because, the Scottish language has more or less disappeared. very few people still speak it. So it's a completely English-speaking country. So what's the difference then? But of course, the origin was very much ethnic. But then also many other cases, especially of places where the minority for which the autonomy was designed are not even the majority in the territory. And then you find, of course, many examples of this rather territorially framed subnational autonomies. You have the examples of Istria in Croatia, Vojvodina in Serbia, and so on and so forth. And then there is the whole issue of, thresholds where that you need to meet in order to activate some rights that are normally personal rights, like the use of language in particular, but also, in some cases, you can even get some additional competence as a territory in order to, if you have a certain number of people belonging to minorities. And then, of course, each case is different based on history, legal culture, numbers, etc., etc. All right, so let's stop with the academic attempt to categorize experiences, because of course there are always flaws when you try to do so. But at least, to give an idea of the different typologies we face at the moment. Clearly, there are many different approaches, but my point will be that in the end, if you look at it from a legal perspective rather than from a social or political perspective, all solutions are territorial. There is no, I don't even think that the distinction, sorry, Sasha, I don't want to, now create a big issue as we are publishing this book, but in fact, I don't even think that territorial and non-territorial autonomies in terms of conceptual categories really makes much sense. I'm wondering, I'm still thinking, so I'm not in a position of saying it's no sense at all. But in the end, even non-territorial arrangements are in the end territorial. Law is territorial. Law requires a defined territory as its scope of application, right? So whatever solution you find is in the end territorial, so you require a territorial dimension for every type of solution, even for those solutions that address groups instead of territories, like the non-territorial. I quote here a very famous, but I think very meaningful type of definition when you enter in the minority definition debate. In fact, minorities as such do not exist. They are not something that are given in nature. They are, created by a number of factors, sometimes by will, sometimes by force, sometimes by changing borders, sometimes by, many elements. So are social groups that become a minority on the basis of a shared and a single feature of reference, and establishes relations with other group which by virtue of a largely but not solely quantitative criterion comes to constitute the majority. So we need to be a little bit critical when it comes to, first, the idea of possibly having non-territorial solutions, because everything is territorial due to the law, and also when considering minorities as a given fact, as something that exists or pre-exists in nature. There is nothing like a minority in nature. They are, of course, a social construct. So what changes only is the emphasis on one or another aspect, and then the degree of ownership that a group feels and that the legal system allows the group to feel with regard to a territory. Our mind is framed by ownership. That's probably what's led the socialist systems to collapse, because people are naturally kind of have an attitude towards ownership, property, private property. And the same goes with groups. It's not only a private law issue and the property as an individuum. Property is the foundation of a nation, and it's even the foundation of the Western legal tradition. That's what defines a state, right? People, territory, and the ownership of these people on that territory. You know, that's the basic thing, first-class public law when you start at university, right? Jelinek and all that. So this is the type of mindset we have to deal with. And then, of course, this is reflected in an implicit legal paradigm. It's not only mental, but as law is created by man, and men have this mindset, then, of course, this is also reflected in the law. The link is always ethnic. You know, you can have, assuming that categories I have tried to identify make sense, you can have a more or less strong focus on the ethnic aspect. Yes, of course it needs to be territorial, and yes, territory, like it or not, and probably you have grasped from my presentation that I'm not, you know, overly excited about that, but still, like it or not, is ethnic. So that's the things. Thanks, Anna Maria, to take me to that, because actually that helps me give the explanation in short. You don't like it, and you don't even think it is the proper way of approaching it, because it's kind of an outdated approach. But that's what you have. So what we have is still the law of ownership, you know, based on this idea that there is a certain ownership by one or occasionally more groups on a territory, and this is framed in terms of territory. You cannot think of anything else that is not territorial. Well, again, this would be, I think, an interesting food for thought for the Roma issues, in fact. I mean, how to approach that? You know, in a way, the only way to try to improve the thing is, on the one hand, on a longer term, think of probably, you know, decolonizing Western legal tradition. But, you know, in a shorter term, in a more pragmatic term, to think of, you know, okay, all right, that's the only thing the Western legal tradition has to offer, territorial solutions. Let's try to work with that. There can be some margin also for a different type of minority claim to be accommodated within this legal fiction. As I was trying to demonstrate, even non-territorial autonomy is a legal fiction because it is territorial. You know, the Hungarian law, which is considered to be a model of non-territorial thing, is territorial because only applies to Hungary. So that's obviously very territorial and not ethnic. It doesn't apply to the Hungarians abroad. You know, so in a way, it is, there is no way out from that dilemma. That's what I'm going to say. So it's always territorial, it's always ethnic, like it or not, right? It's the Columbus egg approach. So the territorial autonomy is always considered as, you know, a way of accommodating minority issues into majority rule. That's what is not challenged. I mean, property, territory, property, majority. But, you know, what is the real big foundation of our current public law system? What is the uncontested rule? Everywhere in the majority rule, majority wins, majority decides. I mean, and then we are dealing with minority rights. What are we doing here? Are we wasting our time? How can you accommodate, in fact, something that is structurally at odds with majority rule within that majority rule? You can, of course, have the egg of Columbus. Fine. Sometimes it even works. But we are speaking about something else, and we do not have the legal categories for that, right? It's like turning minorities into majorities, or into some sort of, you know, more consistent minorities in a territory. That's what it is. And therefore, I mean, it is not entirely fit to solve the problem. Yeah. It does not question the majority rule, but questioning the majority rule is exactly what should be done. yeah, and what instruments are about. Now, we of course observe that it's not that difficult to find out all that, and therefore there are some tendencies that are going into the opposite direction, and there is a blooming of instruments that are trying exactly to do what I'm trying to say. So to challenge the majority rule, to challenge that ownership approach, and to come up with different rules. And one, of course, is power sharing. Power sharing is something that actually tries to conceptually challenge the majority rule, saying, okay, I don't care so much about numbers, or sometimes I do in this proportional type of power sharing, but I always overrepresent the minorities, and I try to set up a system whereby other rules dominate and not the majority rule. Otherwise, we can never have a proper minority protection system. Or the issue of the non-dominant territorial groups, because all territories are actually not homogeneous. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but the idea of a black and white approach, that territory is mine, that territory is yours, doesn't simply reflect the reality. But unfortunately, and I'm saying that as a member and even the president of the advisory committee, it's a huge frustration. The instruments designed in the 90s is not centuries ago, it's just 20 years ago, but it looks like centuries ago, are designed exactly that way. There is nothing like, nuanced identities, mixed identities, that you can be that and that at the same time. No, you are that, and I treat you for what you decide to be. And that's it. And there is no way out from you from that ethnic cage. That's exactly the way also the international documents, and most notably the Framework Convention, which is the only binding treaty on the subject, are designed, are framed. That's a big, big issue. That's a big problem. And then, of course, you find, very minor sentences on all international documents on the autonomy issue because they don't know how to frame it. Yeah, of course, yeah, a little bit. Of course, this can be something that can be explored because it works. But that's a black and white approach that also very much inspires the international documents, unfortunately. Well, I think I can be very, very quick on that, saying that in international soft law, not hard law, but the international community is acknowledging that. And therefore, you see more and more documents, non-binding documents, of course, trying to say that, well, actually, it's not black and white. It's not only property. It's not only me and you, etc., etc. It's not only the state, the reference to determine who is a minority. Take the Ballantyne case in Canada, 91. No, of course, English-speaking Quebecers cannot be considered a minority because English is the most spoken language in Canada, and therefore, the state. Well, and then the Venice Commission starts to say, well, look, it's not always the state, the term of reference to identify a minority, because if you're a French speaker in the Flanders, well, you are in a minority position, believe me. And if you are the wrong constituent people in the opposite entity in Bosnia, well, you are in a minority position. Yeah. They are not necessarily only citizens. Again, a Venice Commission report. If you take the last thematic commentary, I mean, it's a thematic commentary. It's an interpretative tool of the advisory committee to help interpret progressively the Framework Convention, because the way it is framed has its big limits. And so then you feel, you find issues like multiple and contextual identities, that you are not always this or that language, even language identity, can change in the course of life, that autonomy can be positive but does not need to isolate. It's only positive if it is a shared autonomy, not an ownership autonomy. And then you also have the Ljubljana guidelines of the OSCE High Commission on National Minorities. And again, you find the same messages. And even the EU says, well, the minority rights are indeed territorial and can be used by all. And we had interesting cases even in South Tyrol saying, oh, okay, why should we say that these rights are only granted to Italian citizens of German mother tongue? If the administration is bilingual, and every person can, decide to use this language or that language because the service is there. So why are we ethnicizing things that do not necessarily need to be ethnicized? So it's an issue of complexity, variability, non-exclusivity of identities, something that you don't find in any legal type of approach. So different is the law of governance. I'm trying to come quickly to an end. So to continue our discussion, even though I'm very happy that it already started. I would call it Westphalian approach to autonomy, which is exactly the same mindset of the nation state, is exactly the reason why fragile democracies are totally scared, irrationally scared of autonomy. I would really love to talk a little bit about my recent experience in the Constitutional Commission in Ukraine, when this issue was, like driving people simply mad on a totally irrational basis. But that's exactly what it is, because, you mean you want to give the property of the southeastern regions to them, that's the type of approach, and it's extremely difficult to explain that no, it's not exactly like that. And at the same time, it's also something inspiring the claims of minority groups, invoking invoking territorial autonomy as something that is a sort of a secession light, statehood light, sooner or later. And then if we are strong enough, then we can go for it. And the first stage is like, communism and socialism. So, communism being the big, ideal world, which is statehood, our own state, my state. But, as long as we are not strong enough, let's go with autonomy, that's fine. And this, reinvigorates the paranoid attitude by many states. I mean, it's a vicious circle, right? While I would say strong democracies are not afraid of autonomy, and democratic minorities do not see autonomy as a sort of statehood light. Unfortunately, there is little interaction in the literature, as I was saying at the outset. Minority rights experts always speak of autonomy for minority groups. Whereas in the comparative federalism debate, things are different. So minorities are completely neglected, unfortunately, sometimes. And, you discover many potential a lot of potential for territorial solutions in terms of governing more effectively a territory. And if a territory is governed in a more effective way, then this benefits pretty much everyone who is based on that territory, being a majority, being a minority, being a non-titular group, being Roma, for example, even if they are non-territorial. And this is something I am saying. So the territory as a whole, and not targeting the dominant group, which in the end means the majority of the dominant group, because again, this majority rule works pretty well, and I don't know if you have been active on the field with minority issues, but sometimes one of the big problems that you face when you talk to minority representatives is the leaders of the minority groups that are, always the same people. And then you wonder about the democracy within the groups and the representativeness of the groups, etc., etc. So in the end, when you say, oh, I've been involving minority representatives, sometimes you are talking to leaders that are as authoritarian, if not more authoritarian, than the state leaders. The politics is the same at every level, right? So the instruments of good governance, like territorial cooperation, all these sort of things can be extremely helpful to develop a territory. And also never forget that self-government is a way, or should be a way, to deconcentrate powers. Go back to the Federalist Papers, Madison, etc. Is an instrument for democracy, not for non-democracy. It's an instrument to, you know, help deconcentrate the power. And in that sense, it's completely, you know, it's very strange to see that many state representatives see, I mean, it's understandable that they don't like it because it means they have to give up some power, but it's strange that they see it as something that will reduce the democracy in some territory. Well, then there is something wrong with that, right? The more efficiently a territory is governed, then less likely it is that minority rights and claims are neglected. That's the real point. So I think if we look more at the governance, good governance issues of a whole territory, forgetting a little bit about who is inhabiting, who is owning it, oh, probably then things will go a little better. Let's conclude on that. So is it still a relevant option for minorities in Europe? And this for is a little problematic, as I was trying to say. Well, yes, because as I said, only territorial solutions are possible in the end. There are no solutions that are not territorial in the end. But the potential of autonomy is unfortunately very underdeveloped if it is taken in this Westphalian approach in terms of ownership, autonomy for you. Okay, you're vocal enough, you are settled in a specific area. Okay, take it, not entirely, but take 90% of it. You know, that sort of approach. It doesn't even help autonomy very much. And if this governance-oriented understanding of autonomy, of a shared good for all, rather than a private property of one group is adopted, then I think there is still a lot of room for debating about autonomy, territorial, obviously, autonomy issues, including, but not exclusively, as a means to accommodate minority issues.